So thank you very much. I have the difficult task to start. So as a degrowth activist and thinker, I would start with provocating ourselves or challenging ourselves. Using this degrowth, I think, very effective semantic tool, where the main goal is really to question our addiction to growth. And our addiction to growth are on different levels, from a technical level with our economic system, political system, institutional system, but mostly cultural level with a psychological, cultural, social addiction to growth. We are totally addicted with this growth mania, with this always more, with this quantitative understanding of the world and everything. And I think what is behind growth and our addiction to growth, and I would quote an old friend who was killed in the Charlie Hebdo attacks, Bernard Maris. He was an economist, and he was connecting growth with the fear of death. And growth is a palliative which makes us deny the fact that sooner or later we will die. With growth and capitalism, in the logic of accumulating always more and more and more, we have the unconscious belief that we can buy immortality. And degrowth is questioning us about the sense of the limit, and first assume the fact that we get a birth, we will die as a person, as a community, as a society, a civilization and everything. And the key question is, what do we do? What is meaningful to do for the time given, spent on the planet? And how to reappropriate the sense of the limits. And back to the introduction of the morning, it's a question of abundance. And from a degrowth point of view, it's also a provocation. I think there is only one abundance which is possible. It's a frugal abundance, an abundance where we define individually, collectively, politically, the limits within we think are meaningful for a meaningful peace life.
Right, I'm going to take a slightly different tack, although obviously a lot of what Vincent has said resonates a lot. I'm in the camp where I don't quite know what the nature of the next economic system looks like, but I sort of feel I know some steps that we have to take to get there. So I think I sort of resonate a lot with sort of Brett's presentation and position in that. Also, I think from that presentation, his talk of utopian thinking, and it seems that is a lot of what we're suffering from at the moment, and is particularly centered in how the economy is thought about, how economics is taught, which seems a classic example of utopian thinking, where people have a very clear idea of how humans act, which sort of doesn't seem to bear a lot of relationship to reality. They also think that they have this sort of idea, if everyone acts in their self-interest, then magically the overall outcome is good for everyone, and again on a single dimension, which is utility, which they think takes into account everything, but of course it doesn't take into account meaning, justice, collectiveness, and relationships, and a range of other things like that. And it has become authoritarian in that, or it has been authoritarian in dictating how we organize our economy, and authoritarian in the sense of taking over our imagination, our language. So you will hear everyone talking about incentives, for instance, as the only way to get anyone to do anything. And if you don't take that seriously, you're naive. So it's belittling other ways of seeing people. It is privileging a certain perspective on the world. So in order to get to the next economic system, we have to break that control and dictatorship of a way of thinking. And this is where I think economic pluralism comes in, because it is sort of breaking out of the colonialism of a certain way of thinking about the economy, which allows the potential for innovation, for prototyping, for legitimacy of other ways of thinking about how we organize our economy. So it allows us to escape from the domination of the mainstream idea of organization, allows us to promote, allows us to experiment to get to the next system.
Wow, you're so succinct and short. I'll try to follow the example. But I want to start with one point. The question implies that there is one next system. I think that it's not true. There is no such thing as a universe, but there is a pluriverse. So we should benefit from that reality. And I was asked to be here to talk about the commons. So I guess to start with, I would like to debunk a few ideas, very common ideas on the commons. The first one being that it is not an autopilot fueled by cooperation. So I saw in the paper, in the conference paper, that it's kind of framed by cooperation versus competition. So that's not the point. There's a lot of competition in the commons, of course. The second common misunderstanding is kind of a commons as a thing, like the shared collective resources. Again, that's how it is pointed to in the paper. So the commons is not a thing. It's not something separated from us. It's not the water out there as disconnected from us. And the last point is very often the commons is associated with collective property. So again, it's not that simple. Obviously, one of the very, very, very strengths of the whole commons discourse is the strong focus on reinventing property and rethinking property regimes. I think that this is a slightly different kind of insistence in comparison to the degrowth part, and where we can add on, right? So having said this, there was a beautiful quote by Edward Thompson, a British historian, who said, "It is actually hard to describe the commons with capitalist categories." And this brings me to what I was missing this morning in the talk, to consciousness and language, and how we need to debunk the dictatorship of thinking through debunking the categories we use. So I'm sorry to say that I need to introduce you to terms like commoning. So if we talk about what would the next systems look like, or what would they be fueled by, we need to learn what commoning is all about. And here is an offer. I think that commoning, one other quote that is important to this one is that there is a misunderstanding that we need to talk about politics in order to change politics. And the same way, there is a misunderstanding that we need to talk about economy in order to rethink economy. Because what we actually need to do, we need to talk about these basic assumptions our economic, social, and legal systems derive from and rely on. So commoning is actually this, is rethinking the way we relate to each other, that is the social level, rethink the way we build institutions and organize ourselves, that is the political institutional level, and rethinking the way we do economy. So bring everything back, care, decommodified work, etc., back into the broader picture. The only way, and I'm about to close, the only way I could find a methodology to describe commoning properly on all these levels, social, economic, and political, is to use a patterns approach, for those of you who are familiar with the patterns approach from Christopher Alexander, because we cannot rely on principles because there is no such thing as universalism. And we cannot rely on values, I'm sorry to say, because we will never agree upon. And we cannot start from the very basis that we can agree upon or align ourselves based on values. We need to co-construct values through commoning. It might be values, shared values might be an outcome of a process, but not the very start for a strategy. So we try to figure out what are these patterns of commoning. And I will just mention 3 out of the 11 in the economic sphere. We've built up kind of 32, so I will try to mention 3 very quickly. First thing, commoning is very much associated with sharing. So the first basic thing, you cannot talk about sharing if you don't talk about pooling. You cannot talk about a distribution if you don't talk about production, would be the common way of framing it, the dominant language of framing it. So there is an insistence in the commons and commoning discourse about pool and share knowledge. share knowledge generously. There is no way to create artificial scarcity, which then makes price-intensive products that we then need to buy on the market, etc., etc. So if we use the patterns of pool and share as referred to knowledge, the prices will go this way. Everything will be very different from an intellectual property protected system as we have it right now. A second one is pool, cap, and mutualize. But where does this is a way to deal with, how did you say it? Frugal abundance. I like that. Because where does the cap come from? And the cap can only come from our relationship to that resource. It cannot come from science tells us. It cannot come from the government. It cannot come from authoritarian systems. It can only kind of come from our relationship to that resource, so as an outcome of that social process. So pool and share, pool, cap, and mutualize. And the third one is, we call it trade with price sovereignty. Make everything you can to keep commons and commerce distinct. Keep commons and commerce distinct means there will be money in the commons because we live in capitalism. There will still be a need for money. But don't allow the logic of money and markets to invade your social processes. And make sure that you rely on gentle reciprocity rather than the idea that you only get if you give. This, and this is my final sentence, is a very Lutheran thought. So there is kind of grace in that discourse. You get because you are a human being. So that's the spirit of commoning.
Thank you. First of all, I have to make clear, Rostock University is just my second affiliation. My first one is my own independent institute called Research Unit Sustainability and Climate Policy, which is situated also in East Germany, but in Leipzig and Berlin. Well, as a scientist based in philosophy, sociology, and law, I have a tendency to ask questions first and to discuss concepts and also to analyze presuppositions of statements or questions that we heard or that we can read on the slide over there. When I hear something about a better economic system, one of my questions is what kind of system is meant here, and what is the normative framework that shows us that the system is better than the existing system, because you cannot judge anything without a normative framework. And as a philosopher, I wouldn't accept that someone just subjectively states this system is right or wrong. I need a justification on that. And for instance, if we get back to our discussion on egalitarianism yesterday, already showed that it's that we face some serious questions there. My next question is, what does this idea of a better economic system imply in terms of the political system? Many people got the impression that there's a strong interconnection between liberal democracy and capitalism in both directions. So does a criticism on the existing economic system imply criticism on liberal democracy or not? At least as regards me, I probably not follow this critique because I haven't seen a better political system than liberal democracy by now. My next question is, what exactly is meant by homo economicus? There, in economics, homo economicus, first of all, is kind of anthropology. It's a modeled anthropology. It's a biased one, since human beings are not completely, not totally egoistic, and this is even more important, they're not calculating all day long. We are very often very irrational. We follow concepts of normality. This is not the same as values. Concepts of normality is like saying, okay, it's normal to have a big piece of meat every day at lunchtime, without even thinking about it, just normal. And it's normal to go to Malaysia on holidays because all my friends on Facebook are doing the same. human beings very often follow these kinds of influences, and Homo economicus doesn't realize that. So it's a biased anthropology. But the kind of question sounds like that something different is meant here, and I would call this normative empiricism. This is a philosophical theory behind cost-benefit analysis, saying the best world and the best society is the one where the de facto preferences of human beings are quantified, monetarized, and then the best political decision is just counted. This theory is, at least in my opinion, definitely flawed from a philosophical point of view. It involves several logical mistakes and so on, but it's not identical with Homo economicus. Even economists usually mix up Homo economicus and normative empiricism, because the philosophical basis, the theory of cognition basis in empiricism, leads to the result that normative questions are seemingly transformed into pseudo-empirical questions. This takes us to the result that the distinction between normative justification and descriptive explanation gets lost. My next question is, do we talk about growth or do we talk about capitalism here? This is not exactly the same. Of course, economic growth is an important aspect and a crucial aspect of capitalism, but capitalism consists of more elements than just economic growth. Another question would be, what are by now the opportunities and the good aspects of, on the one hand, growth society, on the other hand, capitalist society, and what are our plans to preserve these good aspects? Because as we all know, some things in this world happen that we all like, parallel to the development of capitalism and growth society during the last 2 centuries. And this is not only the development of liberal democracy I'm talking about here, it's also reduced mortality of children, etc., etc. Yeah, for instance, heating. Yeah, this is a good community degrowth challenge here today. This is true. Maybe my last question: what can we learn from the history of state socialism? For instance, what can we learn from the controversy between Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping? Because what Deng Xiaoping said and did, in a way, can be seen as a avant la lettre criticism on many degrowth ideas. So how can we deal with that? Well, as probably most of you know, Deng Xiaoping was the main intellectual and political leader of the persons in the Chinese Communist Party since the 1970s, who tried to reformulate the Chinese communist ideology with the result that it is still called communism, but it's kind of completely different now. And I think one of the easiest ways to putting it in one sentence is that, what is the sentence in English? That Deng Xiaoping said, it is not important whether the cat is black or white. It is important whether it's able to hunt mice or not. And the Mao communism, in his opinion, wasn't able to hunt mice, or to put it easier, people were just starving, and he wanted to prevent that.
Well, you've already heard a bunch from me, so I'm not going to reiterate my position, but I guess I'll start the discussion by posing a question, and I'll pose it to the group in the center, but it's really a question to the room, which is, there's a missing element, I think, in what I've heard so far, and it is a connection between what this discussion is for and how it might actually affect the way the world functions. In other words, if the room came up with the right answer for the direction we should head today, and it was crystal clear to everybody in the room that it was correct, what would happen? Would we simply broadcast it and imagine that it's going to catch on, I rather doubt it. And I think we know the reasons it wouldn't catch on. One of them is that we can't help but live in an evolutionary system. And so if we came up with the right idea that would cause some kind of cap on growth that was tolerable and freed people to live well and to protect commons and all of the things that we would want to see it do, what would we do about the people who refuse to embrace it because they're served by our present system? Are we going to inflict it on them? And if so, how? Right? So anyway, I think this is a really important question for us to address, which is what is the relationship between discussing what system we might replace our current system with and actually replacing this current system?
Well, I have some thoughts on that, and I think we can take some lessons from Martin Luther 500 years ago. Partly because I think the new economics movement to some extent has missed them. It's interesting, certainly in the UK, there was a big statement of principles of how economics should be in the future on 500 years after Martin Luther, but it was all about sort of changing one theory for another. It was a sort of equivalent to sort of theological debate, which the vast number of people have no interest in and means absolutely nothing. But actually, the basis of the revolution was Martin Luther's disgust at corruption. And actually, his problem was that Catholicism was being corrupted, and he wanted to go back to proper Catholicism. And out of that disgust at the corruption of the true faith came the revolution, and the different ideas and so forth that developed was a secondary point. So I think a starter is to find a problem that is more widely recognized, out of which then change can come. And I think certainly, from my experience, obviously in the UK and so forth, there is a growing discussed with the corruption in the financial system, in the corporate system, in the privatization, the Carillion sort of example of the corruption within the professionals, within the big four, tax evasion, all those sorts of things. So start with something that could get a wider sense of what is wrong, obviously, and that's linked to inequality and so forth, and then start exploring systems or ideas that could stop or deal with that. And so I suppose one of the ideas we're working with is, as a slogan, if you like, from a shareholder economy to a stakeholder economy, and thinking about new social technologies, organizations and so forth that internalize values that, in a sense, allow people to be people, in the sense that our current structures, the sort of standard enterprise, dehumanizes people. It cuts off and doesn't allow them to express values that are essential to humanity, and partly could be implemented with the need to consume a lot to make up for the sort of lack of spiritual meat in most people's lives, because they're put into institutions that dehumanize them, and from that problem that is, I think, beginning to be more widely recognized, we can create a movement for different structures, different ways of being. But of course, they already exist. So the pluralism exists over time and space already, but it's just hidden. It's the bits that don't get attention. So by then bringing attention to the bits that the prototypes, the things around that are potentially the future, we get then a movement to take them up, and people begin to see their value and possibilities.
I like to react a bit on that, and I think what you said is a very important point. One of the main challenges is to make visible the invisible. I think a lot of things for the change are already happening in our society, are already present. But as we said very often in Degrowth, quoting Mark Twain, if you have a hammer in your head, you see all the problem looking like nails. And the hammer, what we have, it's economics. So we see all the problem from economic point of view, and we don't see all the other type of things which are in fact the most important for our well-being in our life. When we speak about reciprocity economy, we are in a so-called capitalistic or neoliberal model of society, a market economy, which is dominating everything in our imaginary. But if you really look more carefully around, we realize that the most important things for our well-being are still outside of the market logic. Just we don't realize it, we never speak about it. So make visible the invisible. The other things, I think we need, I spoke about the hammer, we need a different type of tools, toolbox. different type of tools for different type of problems, and make visible also a lot of things what we don't question enough. Like, for example, nowadays, when you meet somebody in the street or in a bar, or here, the first question is, what is your job? Which is something totally absurd, as is we are only defined from the type of job what we have. Moreover, we are more and more suffering for imposed alienating type of job which are not meaningful anymore. And it's something very new. It started 150 years ago when it started to speak about. In French, it's very funny because we speak about travail, which comes from tripalium. So you meet somebody in the 21st so-called modern society, the first question you ask, what is your tripalium? What is your torture tool? And here we have another door to start to make visible the invisible. And a lot of things are happening in the society. I won't be long, and I can take tens of other examples like that. That we have a lot of cultural precondition in our societies on which we can construct, and which are already happening, this construction, transitions, serene democratic transition toward new models of society. And now we have to think, based on this fertile dynamics, we have to think how to transform that politically.
Just some additional remarks as well. Probably we don't have enough time here to discuss what well-being actually means and how it is connected to capitalism and wealth and health and so on and so forth. I just would like to mention that, at least in my point of view, some degrowth activists are a bit too skeptical about the potential of wealth to serve well-being. I think the one who knows the statistical data on happiness research best in the world is still Angus Deaton, and he showed in The Great Escape, for instance, showed in a very differentiated way that we shouldn't be too optimistic, telling people, "Oh, just get rid of all your civilization rubbish, and you'll be even happier in the end." As regards me, I clearly come from the ecological boundaries, from the planetary boundaries. We have to survive as human beings, and this maybe takes us to a degrowth society. But I'm not sure at all if this will make us happier. And we clearly have to keep in mind that overcoming growth society poses big challenges in terms of labor markets, in terms of social insurance systems, of state budgets, etc., etc. Of course, there are many, say, little experiments on how to dealing with things like that in a different way all over the world. But the question is, do they work on the big scale? And this is what we have to find out. Maybe a last remark. Vincent, you talked about what is meaningful. The problem is that we live in a more or less post-religious world. And like 200 years ago, people got up in the morning for the nation, for the king, for God, or for whatever. Today, it feels like we, planet Earth is a roaming space with us on the surface of it. And why do we really get up in the morning? So is there proper reason, and is it possible just to say, okay, there's meaningful work? And given this, it becomes more plausible than before why so many people, for instance, want to do trips to Fireland or to Malaysia, because they're kind of desperate. Okay, what is the meaning in my life? Maybe I find it in Fireland. To be honest, me personally, I find it idiotic, but I've never been to Fireland. It's enough for me to see it on Google. But and I usually refuse to go by plane as well. But this is a serious challenge.
I would like to add an element to what Henry said about kind of where to start, or I very much like that idea of finding a problem that really is a problem for many of us, like corruption. Everybody understands it, that is a kind of weird thing. There are other problems like that, which I would call dependency on the job, that we feel kind of dependent on the market. So dependency is another one. In our liberal society, everybody's dependent on. And another one is Einsamkeit. Loneliness. So the disruptor of the social tissue. So whenever we come up with pluriversal ideas for the new economy, they kind of need to speak to these challenges. And but I would like to add one more element of how to not the where to start with, but at which level to work. In my presentation for this conference, there is a last sentence that says ontology shapes polity. So that very idea that if you build a house and you get the foundation wrong, you build a foundation that would carry kind of 10 tons of a roof. Fine, but then 10 years later, you want to build another layer or another etage? Sorry. Floor. Another floor, and you would need 20 tons of carriage for your foundations, and it doesn't work anymore. It is pretty clear to any architect that if you get the foundation wrong, you get everything else wrong. So this is the power of ontological thinking. Say, ontology is about how do we think about the human being? How do we think, where does truth come from? Does it come from God or the state or liberal democracy or whatever? Or does it come from within the system? So there are a lot of ontological assumptions called ontostories that we need to debunk to get the foundations right. Just to give you one example of how this translates into policy making. I can understand the people, the policy makers, who think that the human beings are there is this kind of greed and homo-economicus and competition and this is born into us. If this is your assumption about the human being, you cannot deal with the idea of basic income. There's no way to connect with the idea of basic income because your assumptions are kind of made for something completely different. So we need to look at the ontological level, and whatever we come up with, it needs to be based on a differentiated relational ontology.
Sorry.
So most of the design space that we are working in is actually empty because what you would build in it would not have a proper foundation and it would collapse. And so before I leave the circle, I just want to level a challenge, which is if you do not solve this problem, you haven't solved any problem. And the problem is everybody in the circle and probably everybody in the room is on board with the idea that there's something wrong with the compulsion to growth and that some degrowth needs to happen and some sort of equilibrium, growth equilibrium needs to replace it in order for us to survive. So we can all just start with that assumption. But if you don't build a system in which those who are enlightened about that point outcompete those who are not enlightened about that point, then we will be returned by evolution to exactly the place we are now, and we probably won't survive it. So there's really no point in us discussing any solution that doesn't start with that objective at baseline.